A lot of you guys really enjoyed my Gothic 1 review and left tons of comments suggesting I check out the sequel, so I figured it was time to dive into Gothic 2. I've heard this one raise the bar even further. Now we'll explore whether Gothic 2 truly lives up to its reputation as a timeless classic, or if it's just nostalgia talking. So, will it live up to the hype? Let's find out. Gothic 2 was released in November of 2002, a year and a half after Gothic 1. Just like with the first game, we'll need some fan-made patches to get it running on modern hardware. However, unlike last time, I actually played through the game as close to vanilla as possible. So no accidental texture packs or DirectX 11 modifications for this video. One last thing I need to mention before starting the review is that I played the game with the Night of the Raven expansion installed. This expansion is seamlessly integrated into the base game and completely overhauls the game's balance, making it much harder than both base Gothic 2 and the first game. It also adds new enemies, skills, NPCs, factions and a whole new area to explore. I chose to play with the expansion because I generally enjoy challenging games, and I wanted to experience as much of the game as possible in a single playthrough. Alright, let's start from the beginning. Spoilers ahead for the ending of Gothic 1. Gothic 2 is a direct sequel to the first game, continuing the story of the nameless hero. After defeating the Sleeper in Gothic 1, the temple collapsed, trapping our hero under the rubble. Fortunately, he's rescued by Xardus, the powerful necromancer who helped us before. Xardus quickly informs us of an even greater threat. Just before being banished, the Sleeper summoned dark forces to the island of Khorinis, the same island where the penal colony is located and much of this game takes place. Among these forces are powerful dragons. Our mission is to head to the city of Khorinis, warn the paladins and retrieve the Eye of Innos, a sacred artifact needed to communicate with and ultimately defeat the dragons. Sounds simple enough, right? But in typical Gothic fashion, things are never that straightforward. You'll be running into a ton of roadblocks along the way, doing favors for just about every NPC in the game until the credits roll. The main story is serviceable, but don't expect anything groundbreaking. Then again, that's not why we play Gothic, right? It's all about the sense of progression, exploration, atmosphere and the weight of your choices. And on those fronts, Gothic 2 fires on all cylinders, but we'll get to that. One of my main complaints with the original game was the control scheme and inventory management. While they are still somewhat janky, they've definitely been improved. Interacting with the world now requires only a single button press instead of multiple buttons. Additionally, the inventory system has been upgraded from showing only a single row to displaying up to 30 items at once. However, there's still no way to filter the inventory, so in the late game you'll be endlessly scrolling to find the right item. This becomes especially frustrating with rings and spell scrolls, as they simply show up as ring or scroll in the world, despite having unique names in the inventory. Overall though, it's definitely an improvement over the first game. The first few NPCs you meet early in the game are returning characters from Gothic 1. I really like how the game handles their introductions. If you've forgotten who they are, or never played the first game, there's a dialogue option that lets them remind you. It's a nice in-game way to inform the player without relying on a codex or similar feature. Your first major task is getting into the city of Khorinis, and this quest is a great example of the game's design philosophy. It teaches you early on that there are usually multiple ways to solve problems. For instance, you can pretend to be an herb gatherer, pose as a farmer, pay 100 gold coins, sneak in, and more. The early game area in general is well designed, offering a few smaller quests and a relatively contained space to explore, which helps prevent players from feeling overwhelmed at the start of the game. Once you've got a few level ups under your belt, it's time to spend your learning points on attributes or skills. This works much like in Gothic 1. You need to find a trainer who can teach you. However, in the Night of the Raven edition, level ups require more learning points as you progress, so it's important to decide on a build early on. I personally chose a bow-focused, dexterity-based character. Progression, one of the standout features of Gothic 1, is just as satisfying in Gothic 2. You still experience that super satisfying zero to hero arc throughout the game, where early on you're easily one-shot by anything remotely strong. While in the original game you were already quite powerful by mid-game, in Night of the Raven it takes much longer before you can comfortably defeat most enemies. Personally, I appreciated this slower progression. One thing I really liked was how the game incentivized me to use different skills. For example, I noticed I was hoarding a lot of plants without using them, so I decided to spend points on learning the alchemy skill to brew potions. The same goes for hunting. Since I was already killing a lot of wildlife, I figured I might as well earn some extra gold for it. I also came across many locked chests, so I invested points into lockpicking. The game doesn't explicitly tell you to do this, but it subtly pushes you into these directions. There are just many more ways to progress your character this time around, with stone tablets, potions, shrines and new skills. One complaint I had with the first game was that after the first chapter there was basically only the main quest left to complete. Gothic 2 does a much better job of gradually reducing the number of available side quests. The game is wide open in the first 2 chapters, but as the stakes rise, the amount of side content decreases. I really like this approach. One change I'm not so sure about is the amount of experience earned from quests. In Gothic 1, quests provided a solid amount of experience, but in Gothic 2 this is significantly reduced. Most of your experience in this game comes from combat. Personally, I prefer the more balanced approach of Gothic 1. While we're on the topic of combat, let's dive into it. For me, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Gothic 2 does some really cool things with combat progression, but the combat itself is where the game's age becomes most noticeable. I'll start with the positives. I really liked how I could use one-time spell scrolls to take down enemies above my power level. For example, I used my 3 fireball spells on a high-level bandit and was rewarded with a better sword. That felt really satisfying. There are also opportunities to venture out into the world with a companion, who are usually quite strong. For instance, Bartok casually 2-tapped an orc, while I couldn't even make a dent in his armor yet. The combat itself is largely the same as in Gothic 1. The only difference I noticed is that parrying enemy blows with a melee weapon feels more responsive this time around. Otherwise, it's still the same clunky mechanic of drawing your sword and giving directional inputs. The progression from not knowing how to handle a weapon to becoming an expert remains well implemented, but the combat still feels more like a stat check, as opposed to being very skill based. And that's where the negatives come in. I chose to primarily use the bow, but in the early game and even at some points later on, I often had to exploit the AI in cheese encounters. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on your perspective, the AI in this game is very easy to exploit. With their simplistic pathing, NPCs can get stuck on literally anything. And I have to mention the dragon fights. They are easily my least favorite enemies in this game, for 2 reasons. One is a clear design flaw, and the other is a result of the game's age. Dragons spam a fire breath attack that makes it nearly impossible to deal damage, since they constantly knock the player back. On top of that, they regenerate health. Needless to say, I got a little bit frustrated. I did a quick Google search to see what others were saying, and to my surprise, I learned that the dragon's regenerating health was tied to the game's FPS. The game is supposed to run at 30 FPS, while mine was running in the high 400s. I thought I'd just force the game to run at 30 FPS for a bit, but I couldn't get that to work without downloading some additional mods. So I resorted to cheesing a couple of them, which resulted in some funny moments, so it wasn't all bad. I used the fear scroll on them, and they go in this weird glitchy animation and go completely non-aggressive. So yeah, not great, but at least it didn't softlock my game. Overall, I'm less impressed with the combat compared to Gothic 1, mostly because a playthrough of Gothic 1 took only 25 hours, while Gothic 2 stretches to over 50. That's a lot more time to expose the shortcomings of the combat system. But enough about that, let's switch gears and talk about the different factions. Piranha Bytes games are known for their well-designed factions, and Gothic 2 is no exception. There are 3 main factions to join, each offering a distinct playstyle and unique quests. This is a significant improvement over Gothic 1, which had very few faction-specific quests. First, there are the Militia/Paladins, who serve directly under the King of Myrtana and are led by Lord Hagen. Their main base of operations is in the upper part of Khorinis, and they specialize in melee combat and unique paladin magic. Next, there are the Fire Mages, an ancient order of priests, teachers and judges, led by Pyrakar. Their base of operations is a monastery, located in the center of the map. They are allies of the Paladins, as they worship the same god, and they specialize in powerful magical spells. Finally, there are the Mercenaries/Dragon Hunters, a group of swordsmen and archers for hire, led by Lee, a familiar face from the first game. They are at odds with the Paladins and protect farmers who refuse to pay the militia's oppressive taxes. Their base of operations is Onar's Farm, and this faction specializes in combat, particularly ranged attacks. This is the faction I joined, as I didn't like the oppressive nature of the Paladins, and I'd rather work for a friendly face. It also fit well with my idea of playing a dexterity-based character. As I mentioned earlier, the factions in Gothic 2 are much more fleshed out, with several unique quest lines for each of them. This adds a great deal of replayability. I was especially impressed by the amount of faction-specific dialogue throughout the game.
My mission is to find out how much ore you have mined so far.
Listen, I don't know why Goran sent me a mercenary, but he must have a reason.
Cool, right? One detail that blew my mind was that in one of the final cutscenes, the developers created 3 different versions of the same pre-rendered cinematic, to account for each of the 3 factions. They ensured that the nameless hero wears the correct armor corresponding to the chosen faction. Now that's attention to detail, and I love it. Outside of the main factions, there are also a few smaller factions you can interact with. You can even join some of them, in addition to your main faction, so be sure to keep an eye out. Alright, let's talk about the world and exploration. Gothic 2 is even denser than the first game, with something to discover around almost every corner. Fully exploring the island isn't easy at first, because it's teeming with enemies. These enemy groups vary widely in power levels, which differs from Gothic 1, where most areas were populated by enemies of similar strength. In Gothic 2, it feels like you're carving a path to the island by taking down the weakest foes first, and then returning in later chapters with better gear to tackle the rest. The game feels almost like a puzzle, constantly challenging you to figure out where you can and can't go. One feature I would have loved to see is the ability to mark the map, to keep track of locations I wasn't ready to explore yet. It can become difficult to remember which ones you've cleared and which ones you haven't as the chapters progress. The maps in Gothic 2 aren't particularly large, but the roads are very winding and vertical, which can make travel quite time consuming. In the early game there are no fast travel options, so you really have to engage with the world, resulting in the player becoming very familiar with every location. The game also involves a lot of backtracking, which I wasn't a fan of, especially as the game progressed. Although the teleporter runes you receive later on help alleviate this somewhat, it can still become a bit annoying after a while. There's one swamp area in the DLC that's my least favorite. Having to complete multiple quests there while being waist deep in muck isn't very enjoyable. On the other hand, the DLC also features my favorite area in the whole game, which I'll cover in the next section of the video. One thing I thought was really cool is how Piranha Bytes pull a Red Dead Redemption 2 by including almost the entire map from the original game in the sequel. The implementation is masterfully done, requiring you to sneak into the old camp under the cover of night and navigate through enemy lines of orcs. Later on, in Chapter 5, the game even pulls off a Mass Effect 2 style suicide mission, where you have to assemble a team to fight the final boss. Piranha Bytes truly were pioneers in many ways. I loved seeing everyone gather together before setting off on this mission. The only thing that felt like a missed opportunity here was that most of the NPCs don't get utilized much in the final mission. But overall, it's such a cool idea. Now let's discuss atmosphere and immersion, which were my favorite aspects of Gothic 1. Everything I liked about the first game is present here. The day and night cycle, weather effects, NPCs and animals following their daily routines, the absence of HUD elements, minimaps and quest markers, and the reactivity of NPCs. I won't go into full detail on these elements, as I covered them in the first video. While I think Gothic 2's premise and setting are slightly less interesting than the prison colony of the first game, it's much larger and more varied. I also think the English voice acting improved quite a bit between the games. I know many of you wanted me to play it in Polish or German, but I wanted to compare the games on equal ground. There are still some goofy sounding characters, but the voice acting is much more consistent overall.
How's the situation?
I must find a way to rescue this expedition. We must do something against the dragons. Perhaps the Eye of Innos can save us all now.
The only exception is Diego. For some reason, they decided to change his iconic voice, which was quite jarring at first.
How's business?
Lousy. Somebody should have told me that Khorinis has gone to the dogs in the meantime.
Though, over time I did get used to it. Seeing the area that used to be the new camp in Gothic 1, now covered in snow and ice, creates a really cool atmosphere. It's impressive how they didn't just copy and paste the old map, but actually transformed much of it, showing that time has passed. And when talking about atmosphere, I have to mention the pirate camp in the Night of the Raven expansion. Easily my favorite area in both games. It's such a refreshing departure from the rest of the game's more serious and gloomy atmosphere. Relaxing on the beach with your pirate buddies, listening to Kaya Rosenkrantz's nostalgic soundtrack, accompanied by the sound of crashing waves and seagulls, feels like a brief vacation from saving the world. Needless to say, it's an area I return to often. Kai's soundtrack is truly exceptional, with countless memorable tracks that stand out. While I was already a fan of his work on Gothic 1, he easily surpassed it with this score. Overall, I find the game highly immersive, with a unique atmosphere, and despite being over 20 years old, the graphics still have a lot of charm. Before wrapping things up, I have to touch on the game's technical state. Although I really enjoyed my time with Gothic 2 overall, I don't think I had one play session without encountering a bug of varying severity. I've already mentioned the dragons. Then there was a bugged quest. The AI deciding it's time to die. Random moments where I ended up underwater. And a time when I couldn't climb up a wall essential to the main quest. The list goes on. It didn't kill my enjoyment of the game, but it definitely led to some frustrations. Which brings me to the main question of this video. Is Gothic 2 worth playing in 2024, or is it just nostalgia? Even though I encountered many bugs, wasn't a big fan of the combat and felt there was a bit too much backtracking, I still highly recommend giving this title a shot. If you can tolerate some jank and are willing to translate a few Polish wikis, you'll find a fantastically deep RPG with immense replay value. It's an atmospheric, immersive and above all fun labor of love by the talented team at Piranha Bytes. It was sad to see the studio close recently. Hopefully everybody involved will be alright. And those were my thoughts on Gothic 2. I hope you enjoyed the video and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Liking the video and subscribing to my channel is greatly appreciated. If you are looking for a way to support me further, I recently started a Patreon. Check it out if you're interested. Alright, that's it from me. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace!